Hello, this is Lawrence Holgate, the author of Understanding John Locke, the Smart Student's Guide to Locke's second Treatise of Government. We are now in episode 17, specifically chapter 12 of my book, titled Conquest, Tyranny and Dissolution. Locke had devoted chapters 16 to 19 of his second treatise. He devoted it to one of the central questions of political philosophy. Under what conditions is it justifiable to resist the commands of a sitting ruler or rulers of a civil or political society? And this is a question that in previous times would either not be raised at all, or if raised, it would be answered in the affirmative with the word never. If answered with a defense of the conditions under which the commands of a sitting ruler could justifiably be resisted, then the author of this reply should be prepared either to flee the country or to face execution. And as we know from his autobiography, Locke bravely answered with a written defense of justified resistance. And for this defense and other accusations of disloyalty, he eventually did have to flee England to escape arrest and possible execution. In this chapter, we're going to show how Locke justifies his position with a series of deductions from his natural law theory, developed in the opening chapters of Second Treatise. According to Locke, there are four categories, or kinds of situations, in which resistance is justifiable: conquest, usurpation, tyranny, and dissolution. And we'll deal with these one at a time, starting with conquest. The word conquest derives from the verb to conquer, meaning to take control or possession of a foreign land. Locke writes that a war for control or possession of a foreign land is either unjust or unlawful, or just and lawful. Let's start with the first, unjust conquest. Locke writes that in an unjust war, quote, he that conquers can thereby have no title to the subjection and obedience of the conquered. That is, conquering does not give you justification. And the argument for his conclusion is simple. If you start with the premise, governments can originally have no other rise than the consent of the people, and you add to that unjust conquest does not have the consent of the people, then you get the conclusion that a government cannot originally have its rise by means of an unjust conquest. And in the notes I say that a sad but a perfect example of what Locke means by an unjust conquest of a foreign land is Germany's 1939 invasion of Poland, ostensibly for turning Poland into an ethnically German living space by deporting or exterminating the non-German populace, or relegating it to the position of slave labor. And the conquest of Poland did not have the consent of the Polish people. Therefore, there is, quote, no title to the subjection and obedience of the Polish people by the German government. And sadly, we are now seeing a similar situation in the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Russia seems to us now to be doing an unjust conquest of a foreign land. There is no consent of the Ukrainian people, and for Russia to do what it is now doing. In the beginning of Second Treatise, Locke writes that political power, or the right of making laws, can only be justified by deriving it from its original, from the state of nature. And in the state of nature, Locke says at paragraph 175, the aggressor puts himself in a state of war with another and unjustly invades another man's right. Anyone who does this never comes to have a right over the conquered. Force does not make right. If one man points a gun at another and demands that she hand over her purse, he has no right to her purse, and the victim has no obligation to hand over the purse, even if she must hand it over to save her own life. The conqueror who threatens and physically forces those he has conquered to obey his commands can be compared to the small-time robber. He has no right to command the obedience of those he has conquered, and the only difference between the conqueror and the robber is that robbers are often caught and go to prison, while the conquerors, the great robbers, are rewarded with laurels and triumphs because they are too big for the weak hands of justice in this world and have the power in their own possession. Paragraph 176. And if you look at paragraph 176, Locke appears to be repeating an observation about corrupt rulers that was made 2,000 years before Locke by the character Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Thrasymachus compares the life of a tyrant who practices complete injustice to the life of a petty thief, a robber or housebreaker whose acts of injustice are incomplete. Injustice is complete if it is, Thrasymachus says, on a large enough scale, and the perpetrator never gets caught. Injustice is incomplete if it is on small scale, and the perpetrator gets caught and is imprisoned. Thrasymachus argues that the completely corrupt ruler is much happier than the petty thief. The tyrant is applauded by his subjects, and all who learn that he has committed the whole of injustice, while the petty thief is miserable and despised by everyone. And in a later passage, the character Glaucon in this discussion imagines the life of a completely unjust ruler who has a reputation for being completely just. He's got it both ways. He profits because he has no scruples about doing injustice. In any contest, public or private, he's the winner, and he outdoes his enemies. And by outdoing them, he becomes wealthy, benefiting his friends and harming his enemies. And if you're looking at the Republic, that's in paragraph 362e. Let's move now from unjust conquest in Locke's second treatise to what he says about just conquest. And a 20th century example of a just or unlawful conquest, and this is how what I put in the book as a note, a just or lawful conquest of a foreign land would be the Allied invasion of Germany in 1945. The purpose of that invasion was to end the unjust German occupation of Poland, France, and several other countries in Europe. The Allies were, at that time, United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and Canada. Their invasion was successful, and the occupation of Germany by the Western countries continued until 1952. Going back to Locke, Locke doesn't give a standard of just and unjust conquests because this is not his concern. He's asking a hypothetical question. If a conquest is just, does this give rise to legitimate authority over the conquered realm? If the 1945 Allied invasion of Germany was lawful, what power do the Allied powers get, and over whom? Well, Locke starts with the over whom question, that part of the question, by asking whether the conqueror gets power, quote, over those that conquered with him. And Locke's answer is, quote, they that fought on his side cannot suffer by the conquest, but must at least be as much free men as they were before. And this seems obvious, and it is curious that Locke felt that he had to state the obvious answer. Surely no one would think that the soldiers who comprised the Allied forces were in danger of losing their liberty by participating in the conquest in 1945 of Nazi Germany. A more serious question is, and this is how Locke puts it, over who do lawful conquerors have power? Locke's immediate response is that they have power only over those who have actually assisted, concurred, or consented to that unjust force that is used against him. All other peoples in the conquered country ought not to be charged as guilty of the violence and injustice that is committed in an unjust war, because the people never gave to their governors the power to do an unjust thing, such as to make an unjust war. That's at paragraph 179 in Second Treatise. To paraphrase Locke, they are innocent, and the just conquerors have no more title over the people of that country or that land who have done them no injury, and so have made no forfeiture of their lives, than they have over any other, who, without an injury or provocations, have lived upon fair terms with them. Now, using the analogy of the Allied response to the unjust 1939 German invasion of Poland, the only legitimate power that the Allies would have had over the Germans is the right to punish those who aided and abetted the invasion and occupation. This would exclude a preponderant majority of Germans, about 57 million out of a population of about 70 million, who didn't assist in their government's war effort at all. The next question that Locke asks is, what kind of power does the lawful conqueror get over the subdued? Locke's reply is that it is purely despotical, meaning that he has an absolute power over the lives of those who, by an unjust war, have forfeited their power. However, he has no power at all over the possessions even of those who are actually engaged in it. Locke acknowledges that the latter part of his reply is a strange doctrine that is quite contrary to the practice of the world. Nevertheless, he writes, the only possessions the lawful conqueror may take are only those necessary to repair the damages he has sustained in the war and the defense of his own right. Locke's argument for this begins by a reminder that it is the unjust use of force that puts a man into the state of war with another. This behavior makes a forfeiture of his life, but this does not all make his wife and children liable. For example, quoting Locke, I in the state of nature, and all commonwealths are in the state of nature with each other, have injured another man, and refusing to give satisfaction, it comes to a state of war, wherein my defending by force what I had gotten unjustly makes me the aggressor. I am conquered. My life, if it is true, as forfeit, is at mercy, but not my wife's and children's. They made not the war, nor assisted in it. I could not forfeit their lives. They were, I'm turning a page. They were not mine to forfeit. My wife had a share in my estate that neither could I forfeit, and my children also, being born of me, had a right to maintain out of my labor or substance. If the lawful conqueror demands of the subdued man's wife and children more reparation for the conqueror's losses than they can spare for their future preservation, then he must remit something of his full satisfaction and give way to the pressing and preferable title of those who are in danger to perish without it. Paragraph 183, Second Treatise. In my note, I say, after Germany's defeat in the Second World War, the four main allies in Europe, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, they took part in a joint occupation of the German state. With the original understanding that the country would eventually be reunified, the Allied powers agreed to share the responsibility of administering Germany and its capital Berlin, and each took responsibility for a certain portion of that defeated nation. This arrangement ultimately evolved into the division of Germany into a western and an eastern sector, thereby contributing to the Cold War division of Europe. In 1949, the occupying powers in both East and West Germany replaced their military governors with civilian leaders, and the occupations ended officially in the mid-1950s. Even so, both sides retained a strong interest in Germany, and the country and its capital remained divided throughout the Cold War. Reunification finally took place in October of 1990. That's a long quote from the United States Department of State. So getting back to Locke, does the just conqueror have dominion, that is, the right to rule over those he has conquered? Locke's reply to this question is an emphatic no. If a thief breaks into your house and steals your computer, and the thief is later caught, everyone in the natural community has a right to punish the thief, and you have a right to reparation for the loss. But you have no right to command the future obedience of the thief, either permanently or temporarily. The same reasoning applies to a just conqueror. He cannot command the future obedience of those he has conquered, including those who actively assisted in the unjust war in the first place. An objection to this is that the conqueror might extort by force a promise to obey him. He might demand the promise of the conquered people with a sword at their breast. And if they should make this promise to obey the new government and the laws it creates and enforces, then they have an obligation to obey, and the government has a right to their obedience. Locke's reply to this objection is that a forced promise does not bind at all. And here's what he says at paragraph 186. He that forces my horse from me ought presently to restore him, and I have still a right to retake him. By the same reason, he that forced a promise from me ought presently to restore it, that is, quit me of the obligation of it, or I may resume it myself, that is, choose whether I will perform it. Locke's target in that quote is, once again, Thomas Hobbes, who held that those who are defeated by the conqueror give their implicit consent to his dominion in exchange for the conqueror not exercising his liberty to kill them all. This is identical to what Hobbes also held about the source of a child's obligation to obey parental commands. That was back in chapter 6, part 1. My chapter 6. Locke has a summary of this discussion that is, I think, worth quoting. Here's what he says. The conqueror, if he has a just cause, has a despotical right over the persons of all that actually aided and concurred in the war against him, and a right to make up his damage and cost out of their labor and estates. So he injures not the right of another over the rest of the people, if there were any, that consented not to the war, and over the children of the captives themselves, or the possessions of either. He has no power, and so can have by virtue of conquest no lawful title himself to dominion over them, nor derive it to his posterity. Well, I think we've done enough. We've gone halfway through this chapter, and we'll close this episode with the reminder that we have to go of the four. We have usurpation, tyranny, and some words that Locke says about the public good, about the law, and about positive law. Yeah, there's a lot to go in this chapter. So we'll close down now with the reminder that you can pick up a copy of Understanding John Locke, my book, just by entering the search terms Lawrence Holgate and the title Understanding John Locke. Do this on Amazon and get your own copy. Thank you. Have a good week. And by the way, I'm saying these words on July 1st, the wonderful time to celebrate the beginnings of our country. Thank you very much.